And what, precisely, do we have here? A ghost? A tourist who took a wrong turn at Albuquerque and ended up on a Tier 1 strategic airbase during a global readiness drill? Cuff her, the voice of Captain Decker, all crisp consonants and smug authority, cut through the tense, shimmering heat of a North Dakota afternoon. The small crowd of security forces airmen, young and eager to please, chuckled nervously. They looked from their captain's polished boots to the woman standing silently before him, and then back again, their expressions a mixture of confusion and sycophantic amusement. She was a paradox, the disruption to the rigid geometry of military life. She appeared to be in her late 60s, her hair a cascade of unruly silver pulled back in a simple, functional knot. She wore faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and worn leather boots that had seen more miles than most of the bombers sitting on the tarmac. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing to suggest she was anything other than what Decker's insult implied, a lost civilian, a harmless eccentric who had somehow breached the formidable perimeter of Minot Air Force Base. But she did not react. As the young airman approached, handcuffs dangling from his belt, her expression remained one of serene neutrality. Her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, were not on the captain or his approaching subordinate. They were scanning the flight line, moving with a slow, deliberate cadence, taking in the B-52s hunkered down under the vast sky, the KC-135 tankers shimmering like chrome mirages, the distant, almost imperceptible shape of a specialized reconnaissance aircraft practicing touch-and-go landings. Her hands, weathered and marked with the faint cartography of a long life, remained loosely at her sides. She did not protest, did not plead, did not even flinch as the cold steel of the cuffs was brought around her wrists. The click of the locking mechanism was unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Decker stepped closer, his face a mask of condescending triumph. He was a man who believed the world operated on a strict hierarchy of appearances, and this woman violated every rule. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't young. She wasn't afraid. And that, more than anything, offended his sense of order. "Let's get her inside," he commanded, gesturing with a dismissive flick of his hand. "I want a full workup. Prints, photo, run her against every watch list we have. I have a feeling we're going to find a long history of trespassing." He looked at her directly, a sneer playing on his lips. "Anything to say for yourself, ma'am?" The word ma'am was laced with a thick, dripping sarcasm. The woman finally shifted her gaze from the distant runway to meet his. Her lips parted, and for a moment, the airmen held their breath, expecting a confession or a denial. She said nothing. She simply gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement not of his authority, but of the situation itself. It was the calm acceptance of a chess master seeing a predictable, if inconvenient, move from an amateur opponent. It was this silence, this profound and unnerving composure in the face of public humiliation that began to plant the first tiny seed of doubt in the minds of the onlookers. It was a silence that seemed heavier, more substantial than all of Decker's loud, empty words. A silence that held a story. But as they led her away, a figure watched from the second-story window of the command building, a pair of binoculars held steady. General Marcus Thorne, the base commander, lowered the optics. He had seen her stance, the way she held her shoulders, the peculiar way she scanned the horizon. It reminded him of someone, a ghost from a past he rarely spoke of. He had dismissed it as a trick of the heat and memory. He was wrong. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type competence in the comments below. The interrogation room was sterile, white, and suffocatingly small. It was a box designed to amplify anxiety, to make the individual feel insignificant against the weight of institutional power. Captain Decker sat across the metal table from her, leaning back in his chair with an air of theatrical boredom. He tapped a pen against a pristine notepad, the rhythmic clicking a petty metronome counting down his own patience. The woman sat perfectly still, her cuffed hands resting on the table in front of her. She wasn't looking at Decker. Her gaze was fixed on a small, almost invisible stress fracture in the drywall near the ceiling. her focus absolute, as if she were calculating the structural integrity of the entire building. For 20 minutes, Decker had cycled through his repertoire of intimidation. Condescending questions, veiled threats, sarcastic musings about the penalties for espionage. Her response to every query was the same: a steady, silent gaze that offered nothing and conceded nothing. Her silence was a fortress, and his verbal assaults were bouncing harmlessly off its walls. He was growing frustrated, his polished veneer beginning to crack. "Look," he said, leaning forward and slamming his pen down on the table. The sharp sound barely made her blink. "I don't know who you think you are, but you are in a world of trouble. You're on a secure military installation, home to the 5th Bomb Wing and the 91st Missile Wing. That means we have big planes with big bombs and big missiles and big holes in the ground. This isn't a county fair. Your little stunt is a federal offense. Are you starting to comprehend the gravity of your situation?" He paused, waiting for the fear that never came. He saw only that unnerving calm, the quiet confidence of someone who possessed a piece of information he did not. He gestured her hands. "Who are you?" "We ran your prints, and they came back with a level 9 classification block." "That's impossible. That level doesn't exist for civilians. It barely exists for anyone. So you're either a ghost, or you're a very, very sophisticated spy." He laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. "And frankly, you don't look sophisticated enough to find the exit in a shopping mall, let alone breach this base." The insult, like all the others, landed in a vacuum. She finally lowered her gaze from the ceiling and looked at her cuffed hands. She flexed her fingers slightly, a small, economical movement. On the back of her right hand, running from the knuckle of her index finger up past her wrist, was a thin, jagged scar. It was pale against her skin, shaped like a stylized bolt of lightning. Decker had noticed it earlier, dismissing it as just another mark of a rough life. It meant nothing to him. He was about to launch into another tirade when a frantic, tinny voice crackled from the small speaker on the wall, a direct line from the base operations center. All stations, this is Tower. We have an in-flight emergency." "I repeat, in-flight emergency." Decker's head snapped toward the speaker, his annoyance momentarily replaced by professional reflex. The woman's posture did not change, but her eyes, those impossibly calm blue eyes, narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. She was listening. The voice from the tower's speaker grew more strained, laced with a rising panic that was unprofessional and therefore terrifying. "Skywraith 7-1 is declaring an emergency. Dual engine failure on the port side, cascading hydraulic failure. Repeat, we have a total loss of primary and secondary hydraulics." A collective gasp seemed to hang in the air of the small room, a silence more profound than any before. Captain Decker, for all his bluster, was a competent officer. He understood the words. He understood that for the aircraft in question, the ARSA-139V Chimera, a top-secret, notoriously unforgiving reconnaissance platform, a total hydraulic failure was not an emergency. It was a death sentence. It was a 30-ton, billion-dollar glider, and the pilots were merely passengers on a crash course with a hard-to-go-to Earth. They're attempting a dead-stick landing. The voice from the speaker continued, the words tumbling over each other. "Pilot is a new transfer. Major Evans. He's fighting the controls. Oh God, the airframe is oscillating. He's going to tear it apart." Decker stood up, his face pale. His authority, his arrogance, had evaporated, replaced by the grim understanding of impending disaster. He was a security officer, a ground pounder. He was utterly useless in this scenario. His world had shrunk to the four walls of this room and the horrifying audio playing out the final moments of two fellow servicemen. It was then that the woman spoke. Her voice was low, raspy from disuse, but it cut through the panic-filled room with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Negative," she said. The word was not a suggestion. It was a command. It was a correction of a fundamental error. Decker stared at her, dumbfounded. "What did you say?" he stammered. "Tell the pilot to stop fighting the controls," she said, her eyes now fixed on the speaker, as if she could see through it, into the cockpit of the dying plane. The Chimera's delta wing configuration creates a stable vortex at high alpha. He's disrupting the natural stability. Tell him, hands off the stick. Let it find its glide. Her words were a stream of technical jargon that made no sense to Decker, but the sheer, unshakable authority with which she spoke was mesmerizing. He was frozen. Tell him now. Captain, she said, her voice dropping a register, imbued with a cold urgency that finally broke his paralysis. Decker, acting on an instinct he didn't know he possessed, snatched the handset for the room's intercom. Control, this is Captain Decker at security. I have someone here. She says to tell the pilot hands off the stick. Let the plane find its own glide. There was a pause from the tower, a moment of confused silence. Then a desperate voice, likely the tower's supervisor. Who the hell is this? Get off this channel. The woman spoke again, louder this time, her voice overriding the confusion. Tell Major Evans to disengage the fly-by-wire backups. They're feeding phantom inputs from the damaged hydraulic sensors. He needs to go to manual reversion. The yoke will feel dead. That's normal. Tell him to trim for a 190-knot glide slope and ignore the stall horn. The horn's calibrated for powered flight. It's lying to him. The stream of commands coming from the woman in handcuffs was a cascade of impossibly specific, counterintuitive instructions. To an ordinary pilot, they would have sounded like suicide. Disengage the backups, ignore the stall horn, but in the chaos of the control tower, where every standard procedure had failed, this strange, calm voice cutting through the static was a lifeline. Decker, now merely a conduit, relayed every word, his own voice trembling as he repeated the alien language of high-performance aerodynamics. She says, trim for 190 knots. Ignore the stall horn. It's a false reading. On the other end, the tower's supervisor, facing the loss of an invaluable asset and its crew, made a split-second decision born of pure desperation. He patched the audio from Decker's intercom directly to Skywraith 7-1's frequency. Suddenly, the woman's voice was being piped directly into the helmet of the terrified young major fighting for his life miles above the earth. Major Evans, her voice crackled in his ears, devoid of panic, imbued with an almost divine calm. This is a friend. Listen to me. The aircraft wants to fly. You just have to let it. I need you to feel the buffet on the leading edge. It will be a slight vibration through the rudder pedals. That's the edge of your real stall envelope. Keep it right there. Use small, gentle rudder inputs to keep the nose aligned with the runway. No ailerons. The ailerons are poison right now. In the interrogation room, a spell had been cast. The airmen guarding the door had crept closer, their faces pressed to the small window, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Decker stood rigid, holding the handset like a sacred object, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly agape. He was witnessing a miracle, conducted by a prisoner in his own holding cell. You are 5 miles out, she continued, her eyes closed now, as if she were visualizing the entire sequence, her mind the only flight computer that mattered. Your gear will not deploy with no hydraulics. You're doing a belly landing. The runway has been foamed. When you're over the threshold, cut the auxiliary power unit. You need to kill any potential spark. The moment the fuselage touches the foam, full right rudder. The port engines are dead weight. The plane will want y'all left into the dead engines. You must counteract it. Full right rudder, Major. Be ready. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the room, everyone in the tower, everyone on the flight line who had been listening in on the drama held their breath. They were all connected, a network of silent observers waiting for the final act. Then, from the speaker, a new sound. Not the scream of failing engines, but the high-pitched, terrifying whistle of wind over a powerless airframe. It grew louder and louder, a banshee shriek that culminated in a deep, grinding roar and the screech of tortured metal. The sound went on for 10 seconds that felt like an eternity, and then silence. A deafening, total silence. In the interrogation room, no one moved. No one breathed. Captain Decker's knuckles were white on the handset. The woman in the chair slowly opened her eyes. The silence stretched. Then a voice, choked with emotion, broke through the static. It was the tower's supervisor. "He's down," the voice said, cracking. "Skywraith 7-1 is on the ground. The fuselage is intact. I repeat, the fuselage is intact. The crew is safe." A wave of relieved, disbelieving chatter erupted from the speaker. But in the small white room, there was only the sound of Captain Decker slowly, carefully, placing the handset back in its cradle. He stared at the woman, his face a canvas of shattered arrogance and dawning, terrifying respect. The impossible had happened, and she had made it happen. The door to the small interrogation room burst open, not with the swagger of a security patrol, but with the focused urgency of high command. In the doorway stood General Marcus Thorne. He was not a physically imposing man, but he carried with him an aura of absolute authority, forged in decades of command and the quiet burden of immense responsibility. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room, taking in the stunned airman, the pale and speechless Captain Decker, and finally, the woman sitting calmly at the table, her cuffed hands still resting before her. The general's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of recognition, of confirmation in his eyes. He ignored Decker completely, his focus entirely on her. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it commanded the total attention of everyone present. It was the voice of a man who had seen legends and ghosts and knew how to address them. "Get those cuffs off her," he ordered, his voice low and firm. The young airman who had put them on fumbled for his key, his hands shaking. He approached the woman with a reverence usually reserved for a flag or a fallen soldier. The general's eyes never left her. As the cuffs were unlocked and removed, he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the pale, lightning bolt scar on her right hand, now fully visible. "I thought that was you," he said, his voice softer now, almost personal. "I saw you on the flight line through my binoculars. I saw the stance, the way you watched the Chimera. There is only one person who ever stood like that." He turned his head slightly, addressing the still paralyzed Captain Decker without looking at him. "Captain, you demanded to know who this woman is. You ran her prints and found a classification block that shouldn't exist. You assumed it was an error. You assumed she was a nobody. Assumptions, Captain, are the mother of all disasters." General Thorne turned back to the woman. He gestured to the scar. "That scar," he said, his voice resonating with history, "proves she's legitimate. There are only 3 people in the world with that mark. It was given to the test pilots of the original YF-139 prototype program, Project Icarus. It's a burn scar from a plasma conduit that ruptured during the second prototype's catastrophic Mach 3 structural failure over the Groom Lake test range. 2 of those pilots died in that incident." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the silent room. "She," he said, nodding towards the woman, "was the 3rd. She not only ejected at over 70,000 feet, she was the one who identified the flaw in the conduit insulation that caused the rupture in the first place. She redesigned it herself." He finally looked at Decker, his eyes cold as ice. "Captain, do you have any idea who you put in handcuffs?" Decker could only shake his head, the color completely drained from his face. The general turned to a nearby terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced ease, inputting a series of override codes that made the system beep in protest before finally complying. An Electrona personnel file flashed onto the screen. The information on the screen glowed with an almost mythic luminescence in the stark white room. It wasn't a file. It was a litany of impossible achievements, a secret history of American air dominance. General Thorne didn't need to read it. He knew it by heart. But he wanted Decker and the young airmen now crowded in the doorway to see it, to understand the magnitude of their blunder. "Let me introduce you," the general said, his voice laced with a cold, cutting precision. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne. No, Captain, no relation. A coincidence of names that has caused me no end of administrative headaches over the years." He pointed to the first line on the screen. "Education, Ph.D. in Aeronautical Engineering, MIT. Ph.D. in Applied Physics, Caltech. Record shows she was recruited directly out of her doctoral program for advanced aerospace design." He scrolled down. Call sign, legend, not a nickname she gave herself, but one given to her by the original Mercury 7 astronauts after she, as a 26-year-old civilian consultant, solved the vibrational resonance problem that was threatening to tear their capsules apart on reentry. The room was so quiet that the hum of the building's ventilation system sounded like a roaring engine. Decker's eyes were locked on the screen, his face a mask of horrified comprehension. Record shows she was the lead designer and chief test pilot for the Chimera program you so casually mentioned. The general continued, his voice like chipping stone. Every bolt, every wire, every line of code in that aircraft, she knows intimately because she wrote it, designed it, or installed it with her own hands. The dead stick landing procedure for total hydraulic failure? It was considered a theoretical impossibility. She wrote it. It exists in a classified manual, under a section titled In Case of Divine Intervention, because no one believed a human pilot could actually execute it. He looked from a screen to the woman, who was now quietly rubbing her wrists where the handcuffs had been. She seemed completely uninterested in the recitation of her own myth. Record shows over 10,000 flight hours and more than 200 different experimental and operational airframes. Record shows she holds the unofficial trans-atmospheric altitude record in a vehicle that is still classified. Record shows she has been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Air Force Cross, and a Congressional Space Medal of Honor, all classified, all awarded in secret. Because the missions for which she earned them officially never happened, the general finally turned the monitor off, plunging the room back into its sterile light. He faced Captain Decker, whose entire body seemed to have shrunk. The Level 9 classification block on her prints wasn't an error, Captain. It was created for her. It designates a national strategic asset. It means if she asks for the keys to AB 52, you give them to her and ask if she wants coffee. It means if she tells you to tell a pilot to ignore his instruments and fly by the seat of his pants, you do it because she knows the soul of that machine better than the man flying it. General Thorne then did something that no one in the room had ever seen. He turned to face the woman, stood ramrod straight, and executed a perfect, formal salute. The gesture was a thunderclap in the silent room. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice filled with a profound and unwavering respect. "Mom, welcome to Minit. I apologize for the inhospitable welcome." The story of the woman in handcuffs who talked down the dying Chimera did not just spread through Minot Air Force Base. It erupted. It moved faster than official reports, flowing through encrypted channels between pilots, whispered in reverent tones in maintenance bays, and debated in hushed awe in the chow halls. It became an instant legend, a piece of modern folklore. The audio of the incident, officially classified, was leaked by a tower controller who believed it was a crime against history to keep it secret. It circulated among aviators across the globe, a masterclass in what they called calm. Her voice became a touchstone, a symbol of ultimate grace under pressure. In the days that followed, the base was a changed place. The airmen who had witnessed the event, who had seen their arrogant captain humbled and their commanding general salute a civilian in faded jeans, walked with a new sense of perspective. They looked at people differently, with less judgment and more curiosity. The lesson had been brutal, but it had been effective. True importance is not always announced with rank or uniform. Sometimes it is silent, unassuming, and waiting to be recognized. Captain Decker was not court-martialed or formally disciplined. General Thorne knew that public humiliation was a far more effective teacher than any official reprimand. Decker was reassigned to a logistics command in a remote corner of Alaska, a move that was technically not a demotion, but was understood by all as a form of exile. Before he left, he sought out Dr. Thorne. He found her not in a VIP lounge or a general's office, but in a hangar, talking quietly with a young crew chief of the very Chimera she had saved. She wasn't lecturing. She was listening, her head cocked, as the young sergeant explained a diagnostic anomaly he'd found in the port side engine's fuel manifold. Decker waited at a respectful distance until she was finished. When she turned to him, her expression was not one of triumph or anger. It was the same neutral, observant calm. "Ma'am, Decker began, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't meet her eyes. There are no words. My behavior was inexcusable. My arrogance, it was a failure of character, a failure of leadership. I made an assumption based on nothing, on prejudice. I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. You saved those men. You saved that aircraft. And all I did was put you in chains. I am sorry. He finally looked up, and for the first time, she offered him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't forgiving, not exactly. It was understanding. "Captain," she said, her voice the same low, steady tone from the interrogation room. "Respect isn't something you demand with your rank. It's something you earn with your competence. You focused on my appearance. You should have been focused on your surroundings. The lesson is expensive. Don't waste it." She then turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the vast, echoing hangar, a man irrevocably changed. The ripple effects of that day continued to widen. The young co-pilot of Skyray 71, Major Evans, made a full recovery from the terrifying ordeal. His first official act upon being cleared for duty was to request a formal audience with Dr. Thorne. He found her in the base library, reading a dusty, leather-bound book on celestial mechanics. He stood before her, a young, decorated officer in the presence of living history, and simply said, "Thank you." He didn't know what else to say. How do you thank someone for handing you back your life from the brink of oblivion? She looked up from her book, her pale blue eyes meeting his. "You flew the plane, Major," she said simply. "I just talked." A good pilot listens to his aircraft. You listened. In that moment, she gifted him back his own agency, refusing to take the sole credit, reinforcing the idea that it was a partnership between man, machine, and a voice in the dark. That quiet act of generosity cemented her legend in his heart forever. The incident became a mandatory case study at the Air Force Academy and at Top Gun. It was known as the Legends Gambit. Cadets studied the audio, analyzing not just the technical commands, but the psychology of her calm. Her voice, her cadence, her refusal to allow a single note of panic to enter the channel became the new gold standard for crisis communication. The official report, authored by General Thorne himself, concluded with a line that became famous within the Pentagon. The greatest asset in this incident was not the billion-dollar aircraft, but the institutional knowledge contained within a single, unassuming individual. Our readiness is not measured in hardware, but in our ability to recognize and empower quiet competence. Wherever we may find it, the spot on the tarmac where she had been handcuffed became an unofficial landmark. Someone, no one ever admitted who, had spray-painted a small, stylized lightning bolt on the concrete. It was technically vandalism, but the base command crews made sure it was never scrubbed away. It served as a permanent, silent reminder. Dr. Thorne herself deflected all attempts to honor her. She refused interviews, turned down invitations to speak, and politely declined a ceremony to publicly award her the medals she had already been given in secret. Her work was not for glory. It was for the work itself. She spent her remaining week at Minot as she had intended before being so rudely interrupted, conducting a quiet, deep-dive inspection of the aging B-52 fleet's wing spar integrity, a task she had volunteered for, unpaid, because she had noticed a potential resonance flaw in the original design document from the 1950s, documents she had access to because she had helped write them. Her legacy was not in the headlines she avoided, but in the quiet, unseen acts of prevention, in the disasters that now would never happen because of her silent, relentless competence. Years passed, the world turned, and the rhythms of military life continued their steady beat. At Minot Air Force Base, the story of the handcuffed angel became folklore, a tale told to new airmen during their first week on station. It was a story about humility, about respect, about the ghost of a woman who knew the soul of the machine. The lightning bolt painted on the tarmac faded under the harsh Dakota sun and the relentless tires of ground equipment, but it was always repainted, a secret ritual passed down from one generation of ground crew to the next. It was a symbol, a promise to never again mistake silence for weakness or age for irrelevance. The culture of the base had subtly shifted. There was a new mantra, an unspoken rule. Look for the quiet ones, a new generation of leaders, raised on the legend of Eris Thorne, learned to value experience over bravado and to listen more than they spoke. They learned that the most valuable person in the room might not be the one with the most rank on their collar, but the one with the most knowledge in their head, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. Far away, in a chilly corner of Alaska, a new base commander was known for his unorthodox leadership style. Major General Decker, a man now in his 50s, with silver at his temples and a quiet humility in his eyes, made it a point to spend one day a month working alongside his youngest, most junior personnel. He would help a young airman change a tire on a supply truck or stand a watch with a security patrol on the coldest nights. He was known for his piercing question, which he asked of all his junior officers. Who is the most competent person on this base that you are currently underestimating? It was his penance and his purpose. He never wasted the expensive lesson he had learned that hot afternoon years ago. Dr. Eris Thorne was never seen at Minot again. She faded back into the classified shadows from whence she came, her name a whisper in the highest echelons of aerospace and defense. But her presence remained. It was in the safer, stronger wing spars of the ancient B-52s that continued to fly. It was in the revised emergency protocols for a dozen different aircraft. It was in the mind of every pilot who heard her story and learned that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to trust a calm, knowledgeable voice telling you to do the impossible. Her legacy wasn't a statue or a building named in her honor. It was a living, breathing idea. It was the quiet confidence of a young mechanic who speaks up to a senior officer about an engine flaw only she can see. It was the patience of a leader who takes the time to listen to the lowest-ranking member of their team. True legacy is not what you achieve for yourself, but what you inspire in others. It is not a monument of stone, but a foundation of principles that others build upon. Dr. Thorne's life was a testament to this truth. She sought no fame, no recognition, no reward beyond the successful application of her knowledge. Her worth was not defined by the medal she was given, but by the lives she saved and the disasters she averted, often without anyone knowing she was even there. She represented the ultimate professional, the quiet master whose competence was so absolute that it required no announcement. It simply was. Her clash with Captain Decker was more than a confrontation between two people. It was a battle of philosophies. It was the loud, brittle confidence of superficiality against the silent, unyielding strength of substance. Decker saw a uniform, an age, a gender, and made a judgment. He saw the cover and disdained the book. Dr. Thorne saw a complex aerodynamic problem and solved it. She saw the contents because the cover was irrelevant to her. The story of that day serves as a timeless, powerful reminder. It teaches us that assumptions are the enemy of wisdom, that arrogance is a cage we build for ourselves, and that respect is a currency that can only be earned through demonstrated action, not demanded by virtue of position. The world is full of quiet professionals, of unassuming experts who move through life without fanfare, their greatness visible only to those with the wisdom to look past the surface. They're the mechanics who can diagnose an engine by its sound, the nurses who can spot a crisis in a patient's subtle change of color, the engineers who see the fatal flaw in the blueprint that everyone else missed. They're the Eris Thornes of the world, and they're the true pillars that hold our society up. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the calm at the center of the storm. It is the profound confidence that comes from knowing, with absolute certainty, that when the moment of crisis arrives, your actions will speak far louder than any words ever could. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.